Thank you all for joining. We'll give people a few more minutes to filter in before we get started. Thank you all for joining us today for a roundtable discussion on Courted by the Right, a growing movement of right-wing sheriffs. For those of you who are new to Political Research Associates, PRA is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. In the first of a series of discussions bringing us to the eve of the election, PRA, in conversation with our movement partners, is taking stock of the landscape of the US right. Today, we reveal our new comprehensive interactive map capturing the far right alignment of county sheriffs across the US. We will discuss the networks that are courting sheriffs and their goals in doing so, what this alignment means for policing and policy, how sheriffs operate as a bastion of white supremacy, and the strategies and perspectives of social justice movements organizing against unjust policing and incarceration. Today, we are joined by the research team behind the map and PRA's extensive analysis of right-wing sheriffs, Cloee Cooper and Ethan Fauré, and movement organizers, Ash-Lee Woodard Henderson, co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center, Juan Miranda, organizer with Siembra NC, and Aisha Yaqoob Mahmood, director of the American Advocacy Fund. Thank you all for joining us today. Audience members, please feel free to share your name, location, and your org affiliation, if relevant, in the chat so that we can see who's joining us today. Chloe is going to kick us off with a short demonstration of the map and the networks that we will be discussing today. Chloe, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So wonderful to be with you today, and thanks for tuning in about another issue that is unfortunately troubling in our community and society today. Right now, we're looking at a map that Political Research Associates just produced, mapping far-right and anti-immigrant movement alignment with county sheriffs. It has come out of about a year of research that I, Ethan Fauré, who's on the call, and Olivia Lawrence-Wildman have been working on to meticulously try to map two contemporary right-wing movements that have actively been courting sheriff's departments and have specifically kind of taken on new strategy and new momentum, especially during the Obama administration. And we're particularly excited and honored to kind of share this now in a moment in the country where there's been protests to demand an end to racist policing in the carceral system, which has really catalyzed this long overdue conversation on the role of police and law enforcement in upholding white supremacy. So in general, we hope this map can be a tool to really support so many movements around the country that are already really gaining momentum and working on a whole range of issues that sheriffs actually play a major role in. So we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into these right-wing movements, but even just for one moment, sheriffs play this kind of unique role within the larger law enforcement ecosystem. And because of that, they have been a particular target by sectors of the right. They oversee jails. They have little oversight. They are elected at the county level and don't have term limits. And there is a really long history of sheriffs kind of playing a particular role in the right-wing imagination, both as targets of vigilante violence and vigilante actors when they felt like the federal or state government wasn't fully upholding some of the racist laws. This was particularly prominent during Jim Crow in the South, but there's been other waves of it. From sheriffs working with the Klan and vigilante actors in the South during desegregation efforts to oppose federal officers, literally like bringing children to school, to sheriffs being a major target for the posse comitatus years later, who were completely against the federal government because they saw it starting to uphold some democratic values and were seeking to build sovereign states. And the movement that I am particularly going to be speaking about today, which is part of the Patriot movement, is about a group called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which has actually been written about quite a lot. It was founded during the Obama administration by former Sheriff Richard Mack, and what was founded along with the Oath Keepers, which is one of the leading militia organizations in the country. And what this map shows us right here is the 401 counties and sheriffs in the country that in some ways aligned or worked directly with the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And what is important about that? Like, why do we care about that right now? One of the things that the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association has done in some ways is essentially normalize some of the right-wing and far-right ideologies that the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association holds. One of them is a close relationship with kind of far-right groups that are seeking to protect private property, a close association in some cases with militia, and in cases where there's sheriffs proposing to build new sheriff's posses. And also what we have seen more recently is this larger strategy around right-wing groups courting sheriffs, essentially to kind of undermine any type of state or governor issued policies that are more kind of progressive. So the huge wave of that was around a whole proliferation of these Second Amendment sanctuaries that really took off across the country. Some of the very beginnings of these started actually in Oregon, where a local militia, 3%ers, worked with the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association to propose kind of counties to say that they were going to preserve the Second Amendment and not enforce any type of gun restriction laws. This, in the last years, has taken off, and as you can see around the country, we were able to document 114 counties, but there's actually a much greater number of these counties. And what we saw is that this isn't just perverse in the sense that they're using the model that has been used for immigrant rights, not to protect people, but to protect guns. But it has also been a signal from sheriff's departments to militia and other sectors of the far right, essentially that they are welcome in their county and that they are protected in their county. And I'm going to bring up one of the sheriffs where that became most prominent, which is in Virginia earlier this year. really Virginia became one of the centers where kind of patriot movement organizations and Second Amendment groups, gun influencers, were supported essentially by Scott Jenkins, who not only favored these sanctuaries for guns in his county, but also proposed to actually start a sheriff's posse and to deputize anyone in the county in order for them to not be subject to any type of state level gun restriction laws. And this is the kind of example of something that kind of where they and in moments are using benign language and kind of benign sounding policies and not using anything overtly racist, but in essence are evoking the long history of vigilante violence that has, or vigilante actors and structures that have most prominently been used and weaponized against communities of color and marginalized communities. And one other example I would like to give is Gwinnett County in Georgia, who we're going to be hearing about more later, Butch Conway, who is another one of these actors. Unfortunately, he's not running for re-election, but he is kind of an example of somebody who has participated in the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And in some ways, it's just one minor indicator of the types of groups and networks that he belongs to. So it came out last year that he was also associating and working directly with a local leader in the anti-immigrant movement, and has a whole host of kind of practices in his jails and charges that have been brought against him for some of his kind of atrocious work in that county. And I think more broadly, one of the things that I'm hoping can come out of this map and some of this work is actually that in many of these cases, and Ethan's going to go over some of the other networks more, whatever dot we see here and the sheriff and the particular data point that we've gathered is usually only an indicator of many things that the sheriff is connected to and a part of. So when it comes to constitutional sheriffs, we are always looking at, have they passed a Second Amendment sanctuary? Are they one of the more than 60 sheriffs around the country who chose to defy governor shelter-in-place orders around COVID? How many people in their jails, how many people are getting mistreated inside of the county jail that they oversee? How have they implemented any of the protocols inside of their jails to protect them against the vast spread of COVID? So there's a whole host of issues that we know that any single one of the sheriffs on this map are connected to, and we are excited to hopefully use this map as one small way to support a lot of the ongoing work that's already been doing. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ethan to share more about the Federation for American Immigration Reform and ICE.
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So yeah, as Chloe mentioned, the first half of the information included on this map focuses on the Patriot movement, but the other half focuses on the anti-immigrant movement, and particularly one of its leading organizations, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and how they have made outreach to sheriffs and these sheriff-centric lobbying efforts very crucial to their ongoing advocacy and lobbying work. The map here indicates we've noticed over 100 sheriffs with direct connections to these organizations, and this has been built out of and continued the legacy of this right-wing targeting of sheriffs more broadly, particularly around the Patriot movement. It's coincided within around the second term of the Obama administration with a realization that federal action on immigration is because of congressional gridlock and myriad other factors, not going to happen, but a recognition on FAIR's part that they could still, in fact, expand their agenda and the ongoing architecture of the deportation machine through this active working with local officials to expand particularly ICE agreements under Section 287G, or the 287G program, as it's colloquially known. And so with this outreach, we've seen the number of 287G agreements in recent years, particularly in the last 2 years, it's quadrupled. And this information on this map is already out of date. There's been new agreements that have been entered in since this map has even been produced. So this is an ongoing trend that is going to continue to uphold current enforcement regimes and additionally empower local officials to enforce federal immigration law, continuing a climate of fear and intimidation in communities across the country with an active support from the Federation for American Immigration Reform particularly. With that, we can just open it up.
Thank you, Cloee and Ethan, for that introduction. Cloee, if you could end your screen share so we could see everyone's faces. I want to start with a question sort of tying together both the anti-immigrant and the patriot movement alignment, really that looking at the tension between CSPOA's contestation of federal authority and then on the other hand, the deputizing of local law enforcement as federal agents by ICE, and how this county versus federal supremacy really interacts in the far right alignment of sheriffs, and how does this interaction impact organizing? So Cloee and Ethan, if you could sort of talk to the tensions between the county and federal supremacy question, and then to our movement organizers, what this interaction means for you on the ground.
Yeah, so as Cloee mentioned, a lot of this sheriff-centric work has been to kind of empower sheriffs against the federal government historically, but in some instances, particularly as it relates to immigration enforcement, it's actually empowered them to actually enforce more discriminately and actually have more legal authority under which they could protect themselves from things like litigation, for example, for enforcing federal immigration laws. Typically, like most sheriffs are not able to enforce immigration laws, but through programs like the 287G program, they are deputized. So anyone who enters into a sheriff's jail, for example, could be processed and then placed into deportation proceedings. And so so the way that this is, I apologize. The way that we're seeing this come out is, yeah, in a sense, actually sheriffs embracing more federal authority, but it allows them to maintain discriminatory policing and uphold general carceral systems of social control and discriminatory policies throughout.
Yeah, I think that is really articulate. And with the Patriot Movement groups and the Patriot Movement aligned sheriffs, I think one of the things we're seeing is that, you know, some of the Patriot Movement aligned sheriffs literally like directly supported the Bundys or the Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation, and were directly supporting their communities at the time against the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management and those types of things. And I think part of what we're seeing, which has shifted now, is that a lot of the Patriot movement, not all of them, but a lot of them are supportive of Trump. And Trump has really latched on to the strategy, some of the strategies that have been employed by some of the right wing that was building among sheriffs during the Obama administration, and essentially latching on to the sheriffs as one tool to still undermine state or governors that don't directly support the Trump administration. But I do think that it is there is a tension there that probably could be further exploited in some cases, where you have these constitutional sheriffs that talk so much about county supremacy and county level governance and supporting the people in the county, and yet many of them are pro alignment with the federal government around 287G, and therefore getting, you know, resources and et cetera. And, you know, an argument could be made around the way that they are not supporting the people in their county by these types of alignments, and just the kind of hypocrisy around their, you know, supposed support of people at the county level. Or even supposed, they claim to be anti-elitist, for example, and to really be kind of in favor of a popular and sometimes even like working class agenda, and yet are, you know, working directly with the feds and the Trump administration, who is so clearly still upholding, you know, elite interests.
Thank you, Cloee and Ethan. Juan, Ashley, Aisha, thoughts from the field on this tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely see the changes that we've seen, especially after the new administration came in, and seeing all these sheriffs being emboldened by an administration that, you know, seemed to be more supportive of some of these policies. An example that I have, Sheriff Terry Johnson in Alamance County, I believe one of the 2 sheriffs that was investigated by the DOJ for discriminatory practices, you know, had only ended the 287G program in 2012 after that investigation. I think it's estimated that 10% of the immigrant population in the county was deported in those years. And after the election, not only did he try to bring back 287G, which they ended up not doing, but instead signed an agreement with ICE to make the jail a detention center, where everyone who gets detained in North Carolina now is taken there. And you definitely see the weird tension of, like, they're definitely enforcing this. Now they're signing a new 287G agreement, which in some ways is irrelevant because they bring people to jail and ICE is there, right? But you see this tension where they have been ignoring all the recommendations and mandates around, like, COVID, for example. And now we have like, you know, more people being brought into the jail through these, you know, local and federal collaboration. At the same time, you have 50% of the jail population there testing positive just a week ago. And absolutely, I think that the way those movements are growing and supporting each other has been quite difficult to handle.
I think definitely naming it as a movement feels right, Juan. You know, I think that what we're seeing from a bird's eye view across the region and across the country is the anecdotes from grassroots communities of all stripes, you know, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, folks of different faith backgrounds, et cetera, saying that they were seeing law enforcement and white supremacist organizations, paramilitary forces, white nationalist organizations working together, and people saying, oh, you're just being paranoid. And I think that what this tool gives us is like the quantifiable evidence to show that what we've been saying in terms of the cops and the Klan working hand in hand is not just a cute chant. It's not just something that we were feeling. It is not just a hyperbolic statement, because law enforcement has always been rooted in the history of white supremacy in this country. We actually have hard evidence to prove it based on the research of PRA. And I can't speak highly enough about what that will mean for the development of sound strategy to actually like stop the over-policing of targeted and marginalized communities, right? So I think it's super critical, not even just in terms of confirming the anecdotal evidence that grassroots communities have been stockpiling for generations now. But I also think it's important, and I think North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia in particular are very interesting things to look at on the map, like literally the Florida corridor up, because what you will see is, again, evidence that proves that when people in these states have been saying that we're not only seeing law enforcement in relationship to white nationalist organizations, the Second Amendment sanctuary stuff, the anti-immigrant sentiment organizations, what we're also seeing is that those municipal sheriffs are also working with each other right? Like, even if it wasn't just that they're in relationship with these problematic politics and these problematic organizations, they're also in relationship with each other. And we're seeing them not be innovative, but we're seeing them replicate the same storybook over and over and over again across our municipalities, which again, I think for me as a strategist and an organizer, as an activist, gives us like the playbook. We know what they're gonna do. And it gives us an opportunity to decide that we're going to come together across our own sectoral differences to do something about it. I think this tool is actually a kick in the pants towards getting our social movements organized and collaborative to do something in terms of like, now that we've got this information, how do we turn it into campaigns that change the material conditions of our people?
Yeah, I just want to hop on that and say that I completely agree and appreciate all the work that PRA has done. I was just looking at the map myself, and I messaged a few of my friends because I guess over the holidays last year, another county in Georgia hopped onto the 287G agreements, and we didn't even know because it was in the middle of holiday season. And I just realized it now looking at the PRA maps. And I think it just speaks to the sneakiness of some of the work that they're doing, but also the cooperation that they have amongst themselves and organizations at the national level. One of the things we've also noticed here in Georgia is sheriffs from these key counties, Gwinnett County, Cobb County, being very vocal at the state level on immigration enforcement efforts that are being proposed at our legislature. And so having those types of voices in the ears of our legislators has been so dangerous. And I'll talk more about the work that we're doing in Gwinnett County specifically, but Butch Conway has been in the ear of so many of our legislators for the last 10 years. And that has meant year after year fighting against anti-immigrant legislation, as recently as 2018 when we fought back a statewide 287G bill. And so I think not just at the county level, but just the type of influence that these elected leaders have at a state level has just been proven. And we're working really hard to make sure that their influence is dwindling.
Great, thank you all. So with that, I think, Aisha, I'd love to continue talking about all of your work. Juan, I'm going to start with you. Siembra NC has really organized effectively to block ICE in various ways in North Carolina. I'd love to hear you talk about some of the strategies that you've employed, and in what context are you employing those strategies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I just want to go back a little bit and add that just another way in which this collaboration is working has been some of the backlash that we've seen against some of the progressive sheriffs. In North Carolina, we had a wave of Black sheriffs that were elected, many of them partner in ending 287G agreements, and the backlash that we're seeing from far right, groups, from death threats to political attacks. I think this is an important thing to mention, how that's been weaponized against them. And yeah, so Siembra has been around since 2017 in response to the increasing attacks that we saw in the community. We're a base building organization, so we work in many counties, and we develop groups in the counties to help, continue this work of community defense. We have a 24-hour hotline, which members of the community, when they have, they experience either detention or they suspect ICE presence, they contact us, and we're able to send allies that we have trained to be able to either disrupt or accompany people through those experiences. And we've been able to stop at least 4 detentions that way. And what I think is actually, I don't want to say the most important, but probably the biggest impact is help diminish a lot of the anxiety that these operatives and collaborations are actually creating, which I think in some ways is the point of all of this, is to create fear and anxiety in the community. We do door-to-door trainings of know your rights. We actually have trainings in neighborhoods, knowing that people don't feel safe driving places. And we use that opportunity to meet more people and also train them about all of these policies that are happening. Because of the obscurity of how this happens and how the lack of documenting, it's really hard to know how many people end up in ISIS hands to the jail. So the only thing that we can do is to make sure that people know about these policies, and they know that if they have someone that they know that ended up, that they can contact us and let us know. And that's how we've been able to help people, some of them out of detention, and in some cases shed light in some of these human rights abuses that we've seen. And similarly, we have been working, through coalitions with, from business owners to faith leaders, definitely with Black-led organizations, to really just connect around the impact that these policies have at all these levels, and particularly bringing that connection between criminalization and immigration, which I think it's something that we're often pressured to keep apart. It's definitely true in the immigrant community. We don't want to talk about how people that end up in jail deserve the same rights as people who don't. And I think that that's something that we've been working actively to push back against, knowing that 3/4 of people who end up in ICE's hands, they go through the jail first. So working with, like-minded groups around fighting some of these policies at the state, local levels, to diminish collaboration between ICE and helping communities being a little safer and for all people.
Great, thank you, Juan. Ash-Lee, I'm going to turn to you. You have a broader mission at the Highlander Center, broad anti-racist mission, and I know that your work recently, and ongoing work, is part of the broader abolitionist movement. I'd love to hear how the way in which PRA's sort of framework of interrogating CSPOA and fair alignment with sheriffs and sheriffs more generally really relate to your efforts to defund the police and the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I make no bones about it. The Highlander Center is a proud member of the movement for Black Lives. And I, as a person who was in the room where it happened in December of 2014, have been one in the number of our leaderful movement calling for the abolition of police and all of the manifestations of policing, and prisons and jails, and all of the manifestations of prisons and jails be abolished, and ideally in our lifetime. It's not a responsibility that we're trying to leave for future generations to figure out. We're committed to, with everything we've got, trying to change this country for the betterment of all people. We know that when it's good for Black people, it's good for everybody in this country. And so we're committed to doing that work. And of course, over the last several months since June, folks have gone from not believing that defunding the police was possible, saying that it was an impossible dream, it was apple pie in the sky, to overnight being like, oh wait, like, no, this is possible. We should be thinking about reimagining policing. We should be thinking about beyond policing to reimagining what community safety could look like. I know that folks in the chat have been saying, like, is anybody like tracking this? Absolutely. What we know for certain is that anywhere between 20 million and 350 million people in this country and across the globe have been activated since the uprisings began. And people, attribute that to George Floyd's murder. And I absolutely believe that's true. But what I also think is that it was like generations worth of cumulative Black death that got us to this moment, and intersecting global pandemics. The global pandemic that is known as COVID-19, and the global pandemic that's known as capitalism, and the global pandemic that is known as white supremacy. Those intersecting crises led to this moment. We'd be remiss not to name the names of folks like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McKay, a Black trans man, and all the many other names that we maybe don't even know that have led to this moment where defunding the police is so possible. I think that there's so many resources that have been put out, not only by the Movement for Black Lives, but by our colleagues. I'll drop some of them in the chat. But one of them is just interrupting criminalization. Our comrades with Interrupting Criminalization and InfraBL put out a whole toolkit around defunding the police that talks about not only what we mean when we say it. We're not just talking about divestment of funds, we're also talking about investing them into the hands of some of the people that you even see on this call who have been creating alternatives to policing so that communities are actually safer. What we know for sure is that police don't make our communities safe. That's never been the case, right? They don't really solve or prevent most of what's classified as criminal activity in this country. They respond after the fact, right? And they tend to escalate a situation, not de-escalate it, because they're not really trained to do much else, right? And now with this tool that PRA has gifted us, not only do we know that it's happening because in no small way are they not trained to deal with every single one of the things that happen in our communities. What we also know is that they're actively working with folks that vehemently believe that Black lives don't matter, that whiteness is supreme, and that conservative politics to the point of harming people and defining who gets to be a full human living in their fullest dignity with their longest lives, we know that they're literally deciding, they're making the choice about who gets to live and who gets to die in the midst of these global pandemics. And so for that reason, I think that there's a lot that, again, we should be doing together. We should be taking these tools that PRA has developed, and we should be using them across our sectoral differences to be able to develop and implement strategies that tell the truth, right? I think that that's what's so beautiful about this tool, is that it's actually affirming the truth that grassroots communities have been saying for a very long time. And I think that we now have enough momentum around us that though their social movement, like Juan said, like they are building a movement, a social movement that actually is not what we value. We also have built an incredible social movement, arguably the largest in US history. And we can actually win if we take this data and we do something with it. If this is just a cool tool that we talk about on social media, we will not, in fact, stop, sheriffs from working with ICE. We will not abolish ICE, right? We will not stop Black people from being over-policed in their communities. And I feel like the hope that I have from this tool is that we do something with it. I think that what it will mean to have this tool in relationship to the demand for the Breathe Act, which would totally eradicate the criminal legal system as we know it, right? And again, not just like sheriff's departments or municipal police, but also thinking about ICE and others, right? That this is an opportunity to use this tool to actually fight for the progressive policies that we've always deserved. And I know that the folks on this call have been doing that, are going to continue to be doing that, and want to be doing that together.
Great, thank you, Ashley. It's really inspiring, and to quote one of our commenters in the chat, here. Aisha, I think you can see the pattern that's developed. We'd love to hear some about your work in Gwinnett County, especially thinking about your work as a local Georgia effort would be really interesting as part of this conversation.
Yeah, of course. So I will start off by just giving you some context as to how I got into the work. I grew up in Gwinnett County, lived there my whole life, and it wasn't until late 2016, early 2017, when the 287G program even came on my radar. I started working in the immigrant rights space at that point, and no one at all that I had known, no one at all in the 2016 election cycle was talking about 287G, was talking about the sheriff's race or any other issues at the criminal justice level within my local community. We started early discussions right off the bat in 2017, trying to figure out what could we do to really protect our communities in response to what was happening at the federal government level. And a big response to that was, let's abolish the 287G program right here in Gwinnett County, which for those of you who are familiar with the program, is one of the worst 287G programs in the Southeast. And so that was step one, right? And then the step two was abolishing other forms of collaboration with immigration enforcement. So my work into that space came in with a very 287G lens focus. And slowly I started to realize all the other issues within the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Department, the massive corruption and use of spending that the sheriff was doing on things that had made no sense, right? The rapid response team within the Gwinnett County Jail that was being fined almost seemingly every year for use of force violations, the other issues within the jail that were keeping our communities unsafe. And so what we started to move to was trying to highlight some of those issues, not just in an election cycle, but making sure that we were bringing them up at the local commission level and within our community organizing spaces. And it wasn't until 2018 during that election cycle when we finally saw candidates starting to talk about our issues in a very public way, where we finally had a candidate speaking up and saying, I'm running for county commission and I'm committed to abolishing the 287G program, right? We had one lone candidate that was willing to say that. Now fast forward to 2020, every single candidate who announced they were running for sheriff or district attorney off the bat said that I'm running to abolish the 287G program, or I do not agree with the 287G program. But obviously that doesn't mean much to us from a candidate perspective. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to make sure that they're doing exactly what they said that they were going to do in an election year. But we thought that that was at least moving the needle from where we were in 2016. And even now, we are coming off the heels of a contentious primary for our sheriff's race and a contentious primary runoff. And I say that because even amongst the, even within the candidates that we have running for sheriff this fall, we've got a Democrat who came off of a really competitive primary runoff. He to this day will not say that he is against all forms of collaboration with ICE. And that is a damn shame. We pushed him in the primary, we pushed his opponent. We had conversations with both of them about what it means to defund the sheriff's department. One of the candidates was really forthcoming in saying that he wants to move funds away from the sheriff's department and encourage investment in other agencies and other organizations who can provide community resources. The candidate we ended up with did not agree to that, wants more money for the sheriff's department, wants more money for training and all these other things, which, you know, we'll get there eventually with the right type of sheriff, but I think it just speaks volumes to the conversations happening at a national level and how they've trickled down even to some of our local sheriff's races. But what I want to touch on specifically is Butch Conway as the sheriff, right? We've seen violations from him as the sheriff, as someone who's overseeing the jail, but also just someone who is dwindling down into some very sketchy tactics. So from, you know, sending people to our press conferences and to our events and, you know, commenting on our organizing platforms online and watching our candidate forums and just, you know, trying to really troll our community members and try to make us feel like we're being watched. That has scared a lot of people. And we have talked to organizers who cannot publicly be part of events because of the Gwinnett County Sheriff. And that should not be happening. And I'm going to call out a particular example of something that happened in last summer. So with a new set of commissioners in 2019, we were able to bring the conversation about 287G up to the commission. Can you stand with us and talk to the sheriff about ending this 287G program? We don't have a majority commission right now. There are 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. The 2 Democrats were willing to talk to us about it, including the one who ran on the platform of abolishing 287G. The other Democrat wasn't in favor of supporting that measure just yet, but wanted to push for a public forum to talk about 287G. So we thought, great, it's finally the first opportunity from the commission level to really talk about the disastrous program that is 287G. But in her mind, she wanted it to be fair. She wanted to invite the sheriff's office and wanted to invite community advocates. So the sheriff's office was invited. We were invited. Members from GLAR and other community organizations that we work with were invited. And a few days before the forum, we were made aware by someone else that a known white supremacist, D.A. King, from the Dustin Inman Society, was invited to speak on behalf of the Sheriff's Department in this public forum being hosted by the County Commission. And so naturally, all of our community organizations backed out of the forum because why be part of a forum like that? The commissioner was able to pull in a couple of other state reps and community leaders to fill in those gaps. And so the forum happened with D.A. King from the Dustin Inman Society arguing about why the 287G program is great, why Sheriff Butch Conway is great against, you know, not necessarily community organizations, but at least an immigration attorney and community leader who were fighting back. Now, there was a lot of fallout that came after that, but just seeing D.A. King, someone we know as someone who has stalked our community members, who has doxed our community members, and has been a vocal anti-immigrant advocate all over our state, be a representative of our sheriff's department really was, I think, the last straw for so many of our communities. And so shortly thereafter, we learned that Conway was not running for re-election, but he had tapped his deputy to run in his place. And so we do have Lou Solis running in his place this November. And, you know, he identifies as Latino, which is not it wasn't done by a mistake. He knows that it's a vulnerable seat. And so we're working as hard as we can to make sure that we're bringing up the important issues at stake, not just 287G, we're bringing up issues around use of force, around, jail conditions, and making sure that we're making those connections for voters so that they understand what's at stake this November.
Thank you, Aisha. It's really interesting to hear about Cloee and Ethan. I want to give you a chance to respond, hearing sort of some of the work on the ground that is informed in part by your research.
Go ahead, Cloee. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to mention one other thing, which is just that, you know, a whole other element that we have been following but is not included in this map is tracking some of the kind of paramilitary forces that have come out to these protests against police violence. And in many instances, some of what we're tracking is these local kind of paramilitary forces and their alignment with sheriffs, and kind of sheriffs being cozy with some of them. And so I wanted to just mention that in terms of where I think like some of this map and tracking could go, and especially in regards to kind of the ways that I do see, you know, sheriffs kind of playing this unique role, and there being opportunities to build kind of intersecting movements to challenge them, because they have in many cases, you know, actually really played right into both furthering conspiracy theories against BLM and Antifa and being a part of that, and working in some cases with these militia. And so just especially in response to some of the comments that you made, Ash-Lee and Juan and Aisha, I just am excited to hear about some of the kinds of coalitions that are coming together right now to challenge sheriffs as one element of law enforcement that seems to somehow have often like escaped a lot of the challenges against police brutality in some cases. You know, this report just came out that 90% of sheriffs are white men. And in so many cases, they just run, or they tap, like you mentioned, Aisha, they tap one of their deputies to run one of the next terms after they walk out, and there's no term limits. And so I do think that there's just such this interesting moment right now where there is kind of this ripe opportunity to really look at sheriffs and the role that they're playing in kind of intersecting in the ways that they intersect with right-wing movements, white supremacy, the carceral system, the anti-immigrant movement, and militias. And so was excited to hear all of your comments about that.
Ethan, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank Ash-Lee, Aisha, and Juan for all the work that they're doing. You know, it's one thing to you know, just, you know, identify something that a sheriff is doing is wrong and immoral, illegal in some instances, but to take the fight directly to them, like you all are doing every day, and, you know, building power around these issues and genuinely making the world a better place is just, you know, both vital and absolutely appreciated. So I'm just so grateful that you all are here joining us today.
Thank you, Ethan. So I want to shift a little bit to talking about your experiences organizing as organizers, especially in this moment of an interesting flare up, I would say, in sort of political engagement with the incredible uprising this summer. I think we've seen sort of a return to a more distracted public, and all of this within the context of going mostly remote, and how that's really impacted your organizing efforts on the ground. How do you sort of operationalize the remote environment for these kinds of fights? How do you get out in the street and do so safely? Just would love to hear sort of the COVID context, the uprising context in this work for all three of you. Juan, if you wanted to go first.
Sure. Yeah, definitely a curveball. You know, I don't remember what the plans were before all this happened, but they definitely shifted. Yeah, it's definitely been difficult in many ways. I think, you know, especially dealing with some of these policies and collaborations, like people fear what they can see, what they can feel. And a lot of these things happen behind closed doors, right? Inside the jail, happen in rural areas, in the streets. But was prominent for people was COVID. So we had to shift our work because that's where people's, interests were. So we did a lot of that work, but always keep in mind that we needed to continue building that base and training people about the rights and continue growing, training more people around Ice Watch and in the meantime, as the uprising continue. I want to say continue because I think it's like it was Ash-Lee put it, it's been happening for a very long time. And in this most recent flare up, I think that it definitely pushed us to take some of these conversations around, the intersectionality and the need for solidarity more seriously and more actively. We needed to have conversations with our members about, why they needed to be as concerned about the Confederate monument in front of the courthouse as they were about the 227G policy. That they could, say Vanessa Guillen's name and Breonna Taylor's, and why they needed to be together in the same sentence, right? Like we needed to push ourselves and our members and our audience a little farther because not only, it's the moral thing, but like as we're learning, and this research backs it up, like it's the necessary thing. That's the only way that we can actually push and win. So for us, it has been a lot about using this opportunity to collaborate with other Black organizations around doing mass distributions, voter registration, we had this awesome demonstration in Alamance County again, where we held our own referendum, voting on two things: the 227G agreement, which was signed on without a public comment or anything, was secretly, and the Confederate monument, which people have been organizing around, for years. And now, we made national news with the sheriff like spending all this money, putting barricades, and standing, surrounding the monument with, the local white supremacist group ACT-BACT. And I think that we've been able to connect the two issues and demonstrate how, there's a way in which we can all work together and how these things align, and how we also need to align if we want to be able to bring all those monuments living and not living down.
Great, thank you. Ash-Lee, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think Juan hit the nail on the head with the reminder that like these issues are not new. That white supremacy has been a public health crisis in this country. And so COVID, though something that none of us would have predicted, none of us would have desired for anybody to have to go through. I think many of us were like figuring out community defense, we're figuring out mutual aid, we're figuring out how we take care of each other, and the realities of, again, like lived experiences, knowing that white supremacist organizations, paramilitary forces, white nationalist organizations, and their ilk were contributing and collaborating with law enforcement strategies where we live, right? So I think that in terms of what I've seen in a COVID reality is like people being really intentional about making sure that folks have access to resources, right? Whether that's, literal like educational resources to know how to make sense of what's happening in this moment, which again, I think this tool does, right? It makes sense of what people have anecdotally been experiencing. But I also think that what it's looked like is people that have the means taking risks in this moment. Right? What does it look like for, white bodies to be putting themselves on the line to de-arrest not only protesters, but also to get our comrades out of ICE proceedings, right? Literally taking them out, right? What does it look like for, folks of interfaiths, right? Coming and supporting each other when we see like Nazis burning down the Highlander Center's offices, but also doing terrible hate crimes against our comrades and their mosques, or coming for our Jewish comrades because they're anti-Semitism, right? And so I think there's like what we're seeing again is like multiple collaborative forces. I think to your earlier point of wanting to hear more about the coalitions, well, the Movement for Black Lives is over 150 organizations all over the world, right? We're coming together to make a difference. And I think what it looks like in this political present, which again, I don't think is like a movement moment. I really hate that language because I think it's building on lots and lots and lots of things that predate our individual tactical interventions. But I think in this political present that what we know is that we're about to face, regardless of the outcome, a lot of real unknowns around how white supremacists are going to respond to whatever happens in November, whatever does or doesn't happen, right? Like there's so many scenarios. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing is folks in preparation to help support communities to be able to make sense of what's happening and to respond, right? To respond rapidly and to recover, right? Like what it will look like to have to be in a January, in a February, moving into 2021, still fighting for our demands to be met, regardless of who was in any elected position, right? So I think there's a lot to be done in regards to making our folks safe. I think there's a lot of examples, particularly out of Georgia and North Carolina, about folks thinking about like, how do we make sure that where people go is like really targeted and that we got the means to make sure our people are protected and safe. And then the last thing that I would say is that I think we have an opportunity here, and I really think Aisha like was naming it, that the fixes, what people think are fixes in these sheriff's races isn't just to get the most progressive cop in the seat, right? Or to get like the black cop, right? Like yes, the majority of sheriffs in this country are white, but it would be just as disgusting to me if the majority of sheriffs in this country were black, right? Like the problem is the institution, not just the individuals. And I think that the point of this tool to me, the thing that I hope people get out of it is not just that like white people know white people and that's why white supremacists talk to each other. That might be true, but even more is because these particular institutions are rooted in a history of being connected to organizations that do really harmful things to people that aren't like the people in those white supremacist organizations. And we need to have a real conversation in this country about why those structures would ever naturally come together in the first place, and how do we stop that from happening, right? How do we stop that from happening? And I fear that if we just continue to do what we've been, my dad says, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. And if we continue to expect that just piecemeal reform will stop what's happening with the terrible things that sheriff's departments are doing all over this country, I think we'll continue to get what we've always got, which is like lots of indigenous, Latinx, and Black and brown folks being murdered with impunity. And that's not what we want.
Thank you, Ash-Lee. Aisha, do you want to add some comments?
Yeah, just everything both Juan and Ash-Lee said hit it right on the head. I think the one piece of it that really came out of the pandemic and really making that connection for API communities, Asian American communities in particular, was connecting the public health crisis back to conditions in jails, conditions in detention centers, and really having people think about do you know people in the jails? You may not know people in the jails, but people people in the detention centers, and we know people who are struggling every day to get an immigration hearing and get out. And that is a situation of so many of our brothers and sisters across the state, and we need to be speaking out for them, not just at the detention center in Irwin County, which I'm sure you all have heard about in the national news, but right here in Gwinnett County, there are people who need to be released. And so we were really able to uplift those conversations early on. Coincidentally, we had planned a candidate forum for our sheriff's race April 4th, and it was supposed to be in person, and we really quickly were able to transition that into virtual. So we were able to really bring issues like that at the forefront very early on in the sheriff's race and talk about, how are sheriff's departments handling these public health crises? How are they responding to the very needs that are happening within our communities? And then, you asked the question about how has this moment really helped build out your work, and that conversation around solidarity and coalition building speaks true for all of us. We were really, our primary got shifted a lot because of the pandemic. So we were able to really sit down and talk to other partners and say, how can we uplift your issues in our electoral outreach, and how can we make sure that your issues are getting talked about in a way that resonates not just with your voters, but also with our voters? And so right now we're working on a series of op-eds and conversations and advertisements within Korean media and Vietnamese media and South Asian media, talking about issues like defunding the sheriff's office and talking about issues that we would have never had the opportunity to talk about if it wasn't for this moment and if it wasn't for us being able to be in those partnerships in a time like this. And so I think that was one of the really great things that came out of this cycle, was being able to talk to our Black and Brown coalition partners about not just 287G. So let's talk about excessive force. Let's talk about the shackling of pregnant inmates and other issues that we know that our sheriff's offices are horrific on. And so it's been a really great organizing opportunity and solidarity building opportunity for us here in Georgia.
Great, thank you all. There was a real through line there. That was really wonderful to hear come through your comments. I'm going to shift us now to audience Q&A for the last few minutes. We have a really engaged chat going, and some good questions have come up. One from Megan is, for those of us building social movements to expose and denounce racist sheriffs, are there any events coming up that we should be mobilizing around? So big events held by Fair, CSPOA, National Sheriff's Association, really thinking about how to target those movements in relationship to their work courting sheriffs.
I'll just say a couple things. One of the things that we noticed is that although CSPOA hadn't been holding national meetings for a good portion of the Trump administration, actually this past fall, they held a CSPOA 2019 Liberty Conference and brought together sheriffs from around the country. So I am going to be kind of closely tracking to see if they are going to plan to hold something similar this year, even if it's a remote type of gathering. In terms of the National Sheriff's Association, they actually ended up canceling their national convening that they have. I was actually at the one that they had last year, but they canceled it for this year. But what just ended last week was this internal training that they were doing actually on racial bias that I tuned in for the last part of, and it was definitely bizarre and kind of upheld a lot more of the notions of individual bias and didn't address systemic issues very much, as you can probably imagine. But I think one of the things that we're challenged with right now in terms of some of the big events that we might have seen otherwise is just that everything is going remote right now for the most part, at least in the foreseeable future. But Ethan, do you have a few? Oh, one other thing is that Sheriff Mack, the founder of CSPOA, has been on tour. He recently spoke to a Patriot group in Arizona and was set to speak in Montana this month, and maybe apparently got into a car accident. But he is on tour and kind of being hosted by Republican clubs, Patriot groups, etc. So do keep your eyes out for that, or stay tuned, and we'll be updating folks further about that.
And I would just say, as it relates to any events that FAIR is holding right now, I think that, like Cloee mentioned, many things have gone remote. Historically, FAIR holds a giant conference in Washington, D.C. right around this time every year. Last year, it resulted in nearly 200 sheriffs going to the White House. And FAIR paid for all of that. And they want a return on that investment. In a sense, they have gotten it because of the increased number of 287G agreements over the last year, many of which have been signed during the pandemic itself. But in terms of like tangible physical events, FAIR has not done anything, but those lines of communication still very much exist. And I anticipate that once the pandemic subsides a little bit, we'll be returning to those types of events pretty quickly.
Go ahead, Cloee. I think you were.
I was just going to mention one other thing, which is that I think it has died down more recently, but when there was the wave of reopen protests around the country, a number of constitutional sheriffs were kind of tapped to be speakers at those events and were really promoted by some of the leading reopen movement organizations who literally were like linking to CSPOA materials as one of the first tools for action for the reopen protesters. And so I can't say of like a specific event because I think that's a great question, but I think those types of actions that might be forthcoming will be areas that I'm going to be looking for CSPOA activity or sheriffs who are aligned with the Patriot movement playing some type of role. going forward.
Juan, Ashley, Aisha, anything you wanted to add to the question? We can also open up for last comments before we close.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that jumps to mind, I mean, I think Cloee and Ethan said what I would have said. So shout out to y'all for being on top of it. I think the question for me isn't if, it's when they're going to be having things that we should be paying attention to. And so just like, again, I think thinking about not conceding territory, right? And not watering down our demands to what we would concede to, but demanding what we deserve, which is communities that are not over-policed, or not surveilled, or not ripping our families and communities apart. And so I think that it's taking, again, I'm just going to be the squeaky wheel that keeps saying the same thing over and over again. It's like, use this tool, pay attention to, to what's happening. Like I know some folks shouted out that there's been a lot of conversation publicly and in the press around fights to get progressive DAs in. But what people aren't talking about is all the like literally life-saving work that people have been doing to do harm reduction work with sheriffs, to get the least harmful sheriffs in. I know that folks know about Milwaukee and folks know about Durham and North Carolina, but there's so many folks that are fighting for that. And that's a step on the path towards abolition, maybe, but the real ultimate demand is around the defunding of police, all of them, whether it's local municipal police and police departments, whether it's sheriff's departments, whether it's state cops, whether it's Capitol cops, whether it's the military. We're talking about defunding the cops. And we know and believe that if those resources are actually invested in our communities, that will stop harm from happening in the first place. So I'm excited to be in community with all these folks, and excited to continue to do the work that is required to make sure that we're fighting against white supremacy, so that we don't leave it to future generations to have to clean up in our wake.
Great, thank you. Any other last comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say just, I think about this moment, it has taught us how bad things really are. I think a lot of us had a pretty good idea, but for a new layer of people has brought us, on a closer ground. But I think it also has shown us just what is possible. And I think that what keeps a lot of people from, accepting some of these like radical demands, like, treating people equally and abolishing the police, and it's just a lack of imagination, right, of what's the alternative. And I think that, there's a lot of hope, I think, that has come from this moment, a lot of examples of different kinds of collaboration and new ways in which we can work together. And so for that, I'm really excited. And it definitely, puts a path forward for us, I think.
Yeah, I will echo those sentiments. I think being able to see some of this data around sheriffs around the country and some of the influence that's dialing into some of these local counties, I think it gives us a little bit of a better place to stand in January, when we are having to really push back on hopefully our Democratic sheriffs who, maybe will get rid of 287G, but won't go the full extent and prohibit any collaboration with ICE. I think there's a long way to go before we actually can say that we have a progressive sheriff in Georgia. And so I think for us, it's going to be fighting at every step, making sure that we're not just, we're not asking for the bare minimum, we're asking for all things. And, for us, it also means, fighting for things at the state level, like access to driver's licenses for undocumented people, because we know that not having access to a driver's license is one of the main reasons why our communities end up in the deportation pipeline. And so we're doing so many different things and attacking the system from so many different angles. And I think the more people that are part of this effort, the more organizations that we're able to bring in, and the more allies and partners who are really not just thinking about, 287G as one thing to get rid of and thinking about the larger system, I think the better served we will be in the next few years. So I just wanted to end with that.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to conclude by pointing people to PRA's website. We've had some questions about paramilitaries. Ethan is heading up a project to build a timeline, really looking at the ramping up of 287G agreements over the last few years. So really stay tuned with PRA's resources coming out soon, some already in existence, to check out, to really connect the researcher activist conversation that we just had today. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Aisha, Ash-Lee, Juan, Cloee, Ethan, it's been wonderful hearing from you. This has been a really great, in a lot of ways, empowering, exciting conversations. This is the first of a multi-part webinar series bringing us up to the 2020 election. So stay tuned, see what we've got coming up next week, this time, Thursday. We have a conversation on paramilitaries. For those of you in the chat who expressed interest on the topic, we'll have some of our experts really evaluating the landscape of paramilitaries and militias in the US today. So I just want to leave us there. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you next week.
Thanks, Jill.
Thank you so much for joining.